Some love stories begin early. The rare ones begin exactly on time. And some, the rarest of all, survive what was never supposed to happen. There is a specific kind of silence that lives inside a happy home. Not the silence of emptiness, not the silence of anger, the silence of two people who have finally, after everything, learned how to simply be, side by side, breathing the same air, needing nothing from each other except presence. Kwon Jae-won had never known this silence existed. For more than 6 decades, his silences had been tactical, protective, the silence of a man calculating, defending, surviving. But 6 months into his marriage to Adaez, Kwon, née Okonkwo, he had discovered a silence so foreign it had taken him weeks to trust it. The silence of peace. They split their time the way two people from different worlds do when both worlds refuse to be abandoned. 3 weeks in Seoul, 3 weeks in Lagos, the long hours on the private jet between them becoming their most honest space. Somewhere above the clouds, somewhere between two continents, they talked about things that had no agenda. His mother's cooking, her grandfather's fabric patterns, the way grief sits differently in Korean culture versus Igbo culture, the way love in both languages is more often shown than spoken. He had started learning Igbo. Badly. Hilariously. With the intense, focused seriousness he gave everything, which made it twice as funny. She had started learning Korean. Better than him. Much better. Which he refused to acknowledge and she refused to stop pointing out. 6 months in, and Kwon Jae-won, the man who had once told a government prosecutor to try harder, fell asleep most nights with his hand resting on his wife's. Like a man making sure something real didn't disappear while he wasn't watching. He should have paid attention to that instinct. It started with fatigue. Adaez had always been vigorous, the kind of woman who ran a company, managed international negotiations, and still found time to cook jollof rice from scratch on a Sunday. So when she began dragging through mornings that used to be her sharpest hours, she blamed the travel, the time zones, the accumulated weight of a life that had suddenly become very full in the most beautiful way. She said nothing to Jae-won. She made a private appointment with Dr. Seo at the Seoul Women's Clinic, the one whose discretion Jae-won trusted with his own health. She went alone on a Tuesday morning while Jae-won was in back-to-back meetings restructuring the empire's legitimate holdings. She sat in the examination room and answered the doctor's questions patiently. When the first test came back, Dr. Seo looked at the result, then looked at Adaez, then looked at the result again. She said, "Mrs. Kwon, I need to run this a second time." Why? Because the result is unexpected. The second test took 11 minutes. They were the longest 11 minutes of Adaez's 56 years on Earth. When Dr. Seo came back in, she set the result on the table between them with the careful, deliberate gentleness of someone handling something fragile and enormous simultaneously. "Mrs. Kwon," she said slowly, "you are pregnant." The word landed in the room and just stayed there. Adaez stared at the doctor. "That's not possible." "I know what the medical literature says about conception at your age. I know what we would have told you 12 months ago if you'd asked. But the tests are unambiguous. You are approximately 7 weeks along. The embryo appears, against every probability, healthy and implanted correctly." Adaez sat very still. Outside the clinic window, Seoul moved the way it always moved. Fast, electric, relentless. Taxis and pedestrians and the vast machine of a city that never paused to register individual miracles. But inside that room, a 56-year-old Nigerian woman who had waited 30 years, buried one love, survived a corporate war, walked into the most dangerous room in South Korea with her chin raised and found the one man her mother had been describing without knowing his name, pressed both hands flat against her stomach. And for the first time since her wedding night, she cried. Not from grief, from the terrifying, overwhelming, breathtaking weight of being chosen by life itself. What Adayas did not know, what no one at the clinic knew, was that Kwon Dae-sung had eyes everywhere. He had spent 40 years perfecting that particular art. Kwon Dae-sung was 74 years old, and if you passed him at a state dinner or a charitable fundraiser, you would see a distinguished silver-haired Korean patriarch, gracious, measured, the kind of man who remembered your children's names and sent gifts on the right holidays. You would not see the man who had ordered his own brother's death. You would not see the man who had spent the last 6 months watching his nephew's marriage with the focused attention of a predator studying prey. After Yoojin's revelation at the charity gala, Dae-sung had become obsessed with the Nigerian woman who had entered his nephew's life. He had investigators quietly compile everything they could find: business records, old interviews, university archives, family connections, and forgotten pieces of her past. What began as curiosity had become surveillance. By the time Adayas and Jae-won married, Dae-sung knew enough about her history to understand exactly where her deepest wounds lived. When his contact inside the clinic forwarded him the confirmation: pregnancy, 7 weeks, Mrs. Kwon Adayese, Dae-sung set down his teacup. He sat in silence for a long time. He had survived everything: the prosecution, Park Sung-ho's exposure, even the quiet but devastating restructuring of the Kwon Empire that had slowly, methodically dismantled 3 of his shadow businesses over the past 4 months. Jae-won had been careful, patient, surgical. He had survived all of it because he had always had one advantage over his nephew. Jae-won's weakness was that he now had something to lose. And a child, changed everything. A child between Jae-won and this Nigerian woman was not just an heir. It was a permanent lock on the Kwon bloodline that would push Dae-sung's own interests into irrelevance for generations. He picked up his phone, made one call to a man in a nondescript office in Gangnam who specialized in a very specific kind of work. "I need a package built," he said quietly. "Complete. Convincing. The kind a brilliant woman believes because she needs to." "Who is the target?" "Her trust in her husband," Dae-sung said simply. "Destroy that, and the rest destroys itself." Adayas had decided to tell Jae-won on Friday. She had planned it the way she planned everything important, with intention and care. She found an Ixora plant in a Seoul market, the same deep orange her mother had loved, and placed it on the penthouse table. She cooked, not Korean food this time, not Nigerian food, but both simultaneously, the 2 kitchens of her life sharing one stove. She set the table properly. She wore the gold bracelet and the earrings from her mother. She was going to tell him over dinner that the miracle they hadn't dared to ask for had arrived anyway. The envelope came on Thursday morning. A courier, unmarked, her name written in precise formal Korean script that looked almost official. No return address. She almost didn't open it. Something in her, that same instinct that had made her close the acquisition folder in the Lagos boardroom, told her to be careful. She opened it at the kitchen table while Jae-won was in the shower. Inside were photographs, documents, 3 USB drives, a handwritten index. She looked at the first photograph and went still. It was Jae-won, younger, perhaps 40, seated in a room she didn't recognize with men she didn't know. The photograph had a date stamp. The date stamp was 1 week after the car accident on the Lagos-Ibadan expressway that had taken Emeka from her. The man she was going to marry at 31. She turned to the documents. They were in Korean and English. She read Korean now. Enough. More than enough. They were internal communications from a Kwon Empire entity she had never heard of, referencing an operation in Nigeria, referencing a witness elimination, referencing a name, E. Okafor, Lagos-Ibadan corridor, neutralized. Emeka's full name was Emeka Okafor. The room tilted. She turned to the next document, and the next, each one building a case, brick by terrible brick, that Kwon Jae-won had known from the beginning who she was. Not just the CEO of a textile company, but the woman whose late fiancé had been present at a meeting in Port Harcourt in 1994 where he had witnessed something he shouldn't have. Something connected to the Kwon family's early criminal empire. The document suggested that the entire acquisition, the debt purchase, the representatives sent to Lagos, the invitation to Seoul, had been a controlled operation to get her close, to assess whether she knew what Emeka had seen, to monitor her. The final page was the worst, a memo. From an executive address she recognized, the same floor as Jaewon's office, dated 18 months ago, 3 months before the acquisition. Subject: Okonkwo, A. Assessment complete. Asset poses no threat. File for close monitoring. Romantic approach may be viable as long-term containment strategy. The words romantic approach and containment strategy on the same line. Adiaza sat with the documents spread across the table for a very long time. She heard the shower stop. She heard Jaewon moving in the bedroom, his familiar, unhurried movements. The particular silence of a man who had finally learned how to move through a home without guarding himself. She gathered every document, every photograph, every USB drive. She put them back in the envelope. She stood up. She walked to the bedroom and looked at him through the doorway. Her husband, pulling on a shirt, his silver-streaked hair still damp, his back to her, completely unguarded in the way he only ever was with her. She memorized him, because she already knew what she was going to do. She left while he was on a call with Tokyo. She had 40 minutes. She used every one of them precisely. She packed one bag, not the designer luggage he had bought her, but her own old travel bag, the one that had been to Oxford and back, the one that carried the smell of Lagos and purpose. She took her passport, her grandmother's bracelet, her mother's earrings, the original incorporation documents for Okonkwo Heritage Textiles. Always with her. Always. She left the envelope on the kitchen table. She wrote 3 words on the back of a receipt she found in her pocket. Don't look for me. She was in the elevator before the call ended. She was in a taxi before he reached the kitchen. She was at Incheon Airport before he picked up the note. She was boarding under her maiden name, Okonkwo, because even in her devastation, some part of her that had been a businesswoman for 30 years had thought ahead. On the plane, somewhere over the Middle East, she pressed her hand to her stomach. She hadn't told him. She wasn't going to. Not until she knew what was true. And if what was in that envelope was true, she closed her eyes. She thought of her mother. Don't give yourself to anyone who doesn't understand what they're receiving. She thought of Emeka, gone at 31 on a Tuesday morning that should have been ordinary. She pressed her hand harder against her stomach. I will protect you, she told the child she was only beginning to believe in. Whatever it costs me. Whatever it costs me. He read the note once. He read it a second time. Then he set it down on the table with the same deliberate care he gave to things that were destroying him, walked to the window, and stood there for exactly 4 minutes. His assistant later said, to no one, because she valued her job and her life, that those 4 minutes were the only time in 11 years she had seen Kwon Jae-won look afraid. Not the fear of physical danger. He had always been beyond that. The fear of a man who realizes that the only thing he has ever truly been unable to control, the only thing he did not know how to defend against or negotiate with, is the departure of someone he cannot bear to lose. Then he turned around and became something his enemies had always dreaded and his allies had always depended upon. Focused. Cancel everything, he said to his assistant. Everything. Every meeting. Every call. Every obligation for the next 30 days. Sir, the Tokyo board meeting. Cancel it. The government liaison dinner. Cancel it. Sir, the chairman of... I don't care if the president of South Korea himself is on that list, Jae-won said quietly. Cancel. Everything. He opened the envelope she'd left. He spent 90 minutes going through every document, every photograph, every page. He recognized the fabrication in 11 minutes. Not because he was defensive, but because he was precise. The memo supposedly from his office floor used a font that his company had standardized away from in 2019. The internal entity name didn't exist in the Quan Empire structure. He knew every subsidiary, every shell, every filing. The photograph dated 1 week after Emeka Okafor's accident was real. But the meeting it depicted was a legitimate textile industry conference in Jeju. He had been photographed with 30 other businessmen. Someone had cropped the image to tell a different story. Dae Sung. He said his uncle's name in the empty penthouse, and the word carried every year of what was now confirmed. Every crime, every manipulation, every instrument of destruction the man had deployed over 4 decades. But even as the fury rose, cold, precise, lethal, a second feeling moved underneath it. Adaze was alone somewhere, carrying something he didn't know about yet, running from a lie that had been built specifically to fit the shape of her deepest wound. They had used Emeka against her. They had taken the name of the man she had mourned for 20 years and turned it into a weapon. Jae-won picked up his phone. "Find her," he said. "Every resource, every contact. I don't care what it costs." He paused. "And find me everything there is to know about a man named Emeka Okafor. Port Harcourt, 1994. Adaze didn't go to the family compound. Chisholm was there, and Chisholm, who loved her more than sense, would take one look at her face and know everything. Adaze wasn't ready for that yet. She needed to think. She needed clarity. She needed the one place in the world where she had always been most herself. She went to the factory. She let herself in with her key, the original iron key that had opened this door since her grandfather's time, that her mother had carried on a red lanyard, that Adaeze now kept in the interior pocket of every bag she owned. The factory was quiet at night, enormous and dark and smelling of fabric and machine oil and the particular dusty warmth of a building that had been full of human industry for 7 decades. She turned on one light, the old lamp her mother used to use when she stayed late, and sat down on the same wooden crate she'd sat on the night she decided to go back to Seoul. She thought about everything. She was methodical about it. Not emotional. She saved the emotion for later, the way her mother had taught her, the way Igbo women learn to process pain, deeply, privately, and completely, so that when you emerge whole. She laid out everything she knew. The documents said Jae-won had ordered Emeka's death. But she thought about the man she had watched fall apart over his brother's murder. She thought about the knuckles splitting grief over a betrayal he'd carried for 20 years. She thought about the Ixora flowers on the rooftop. She thought about the way he'd said hope, like a man who had just remembered the word existed. Could that man have ordered a young man's death to silence a witness? She pressed her hands together and closed her eyes. Then she opened them and did what she had done her entire career. She went looking for evidence that the story was wrong. She pulled out her laptop. She started from the beginning. She spent 4 hours going through everything in the envelope, every date, every name, every reference, against public records, archived newspapers, business filings. By 2 in the morning, she had found the font discrepancy. By 3, she had traced the subsidiary name to a filing that didn't exist. By 4, she was sitting very still in the lamplight, with the realizations settling over her like cold water, slow and total and irreversible. It was fabricated. All of it. Someone had constructed a lie so perfectly shaped around her specific grief that only a woman who had loved Emeka Okafor could have been destroyed by it. Only someone who knew her history, her wound, her 31. Who knew that much about her? Her blood went cold. Someone had been watching her long before Jae-won ever sent a representative to Lagos. And whoever had built this dossier hadn't just wanted to separate her from her husband. They had wanted her to disappear before she could tell Jae-won what she was carrying. Her hand went to her stomach. Oh, she thought. Oh, this is about the child. Jae-won's people found the answer in 72 hours. What they found was worse and better than anything he had expected. Emeka Okafor had indeed been in Port Harcourt in 1994, but not as a witness to a Kwon family crime. He had been present at a meeting organised by Kwon Dae-sung himself, a meeting in which Dae-sung was brokering a fraudulent land deal that would have displaced 3,000 Nigerian families from oil-adjacent land. Emeka, who was a young environmental lawyer at the time, had stumbled into the meeting by accident through a mutual contact. He had seen Dae-sung's face, he had heard his name, he had documented everything in a private letter that, 11 months later, he had told Ades he was going to submit to an international trade commission. 11 days before the wedding, 11 days before the Lagos-Ibadan Expressway. The accident had never been an accident. Kwon Dae-sung had ordered it. Not Jae-won. Not the Kwon Empire. Dae-sung. Alone. Acting outside the family's knowledge, the way he had always operated. In shadow, beneath the structure, using the family name as cover for crimes that the family would never have sanctioned. Jae-won sat with this information for a long time. Adaeze had spent 24 years mourning a man who was killed by the same uncle who had killed Jae-won's father. The same man. Across 2 continents. Across 2 decades. Across 2 completely separate lives that had never been supposed to intersect. Until they did. Until a boardroom in Lagos, and a fencing gym in Seoul, and an impossible dinner table in a penthouse, and a rooftop full of Ixora flowers had brought together the 2 people most catastrophically wronged by Kwon Dae-sung's existence. It was not coincidence. Jae-won was not a man who believed in coincidence. He believed in consequence. And Dae-sung's consequence was coming. But first, he had to find his wife. It was 6 in the morning when she heard it. 3 knocks. Quiet but deliberate. The kind of knock that says, "I know you're in there. I'm not leaving. But I'm not going to break the door down either." She knew before she opened it. She had known, on some cellular level, since the plane. She had known the way you know the end of a storm, not because the rain stops, but because the air changes. She opened the factory door. Kwon Jae-won stood on the other side, not in a suit, not in the armour of his empire. He wore dark trousers and a plain grey shirt, the clothes of a man who had come directly from wherever he was, the moment he found out where she was and had not stopped to think about anything except getting to this door. He had been on a plane for 9 hours. His eyes found her immediately, and in those first 2 seconds, before either of them spoke, she watched something happen in his face that she had only seen once before, at the Seoul hallway, after Sung-ho left, the edges giving way, the man behind the empire becoming briefly completely visible. He looked at her. She looked at him. He said nothing about the note, nothing about the 3 days, nothing about the private terror of not knowing where she was while everything he valued had vanished from his penthouse overnight. He said, "The dossier was fabricated. Every document, every photograph. I can prove all of it. But that's not, Ada, that is not why I'm standing here." His voice, so precisely controlled in every room in every country, was raw. "Why are you standing here?" she asked. "Because I need you to look me in the eyes," he said, "and tell me you actually believed it. Tell me that after everything after the tea and the rooftop and the silence on the plane and every single thing that has happened between us, tell me that somewhere inside you, you truly believe I am the kind of man who would do what those documents said." The Lagos morning was warming behind him, the sky over the factory roof turning the particular orange-pink of a Nigerian dawn. She looked at him. For a long time. "No," she said finally. "I didn't believe it. Not completely. But I was afraid of what it would mean if I was wrong. And I have been wrong before, about a man I trusted, and it cost me everything." "Emeka." She blinked. "How do you know that name?" And then he told her. All of it. He stood in the doorway of her grandfather's factory, in the growing Lagos dawn, and told her the truth about Port Harcourt, 1994, about the land deal and the young lawyer and the Lagos-Ibadan Expressway and the single man responsible for all of it. She listened without speaking. When he finished, The sun was fully up. She sat down slowly on the old wooden crate, the one that had held her through every pivotal moment in this factory for 30 years, and put both hands over her face. He crossed the factory floor, crouched in front of her, and waited. He did not touch her. He did not rush her. He simply waited. The way a man waits when he understands that some pain needs to be met with presence, not with fixing. When she finally lowered her hands, her eyes were wet, but her face was composed. He died because he was trying to do the right thing, she said. Yes, and the same man. Yes. All this time, she said quietly. Dae-sung has been in the background of both our lives, taking things from both of us. Yes, she looked at him. Then we end it together. He held her gaze. Ada, there is something else you need to tell me. She went still. I know you went to Dr. Seo, he said softly. I know because she called me the morning after your appointment, not to tell me the result, but to tell me you seemed shaken and had left alone. I didn't push. I was waiting for you to tell me in your own time. The factory was quiet. The morning light came through the high windows exactly the way it had her whole life. She reached down and took his hand from where it rested on the crate beside her knee. She placed it, very carefully, against her stomach. He looked down at his hand, then up at her face. The silence between them was so full it had its own gravity. 7 weeks, she said. She watched the news move through him, not like an explosion, like a tide, rising slowly, steadily, unstoppably, until it covered everything. His jaw tightened, then released. His eyes grew bright in a way she had never seen before. 7 weeks, he repeated, barely above a whisper. The doctor called it statistically impossible. She doesn't know you, he said, and something broke open between them. Not with words, not with drama, but with the simple, staggering weight of two people who had survived every worst thing and arrived against all probability at this ordinary, extraordinary morning in a Lagos factory with the sun coming through old windows and a miracle between them. He pressed his forehead against hers. She felt him exhale, completely, for the first time. I've got you, he said. Both of you. Whatever comes next, I've got you. They gave themselves 3 days. 3 days in Lagos. No empire, no soul, no uncle, no strategy. Just the compound and the factory and Chisholm screaming with joy so loud the neighbours came out of their houses. Just phone calls to Jaewon's mother in Busan, who wept and said in Korean what roughly translated to, I always knew God had a sense of humour. Just two people learning what it felt like to stand inside good news without waiting for it to be taken away. On the 4th day, Jaewon made a call. Not to his lawyers, not to his business team, to a contact inside the South Korean National Investigation Unit, a man who had been quietly building a case against Kwon Dae-sung for 7 years and had never had enough. I have everything you need, Jaewon said. The Port Harcourt land fraud, the 1994 Nigerian casualty, the fabricated dossier used to interfere with a private citizen, the evidence connecting Dae-sung to my father's death and my brother's death, all of it. Documented, sourced, and ready for submission. A pause on the line. Mr. Kwon, are you certain you want to do this? This level of exposure? My wife, Jaewon said quietly, spent 24 years grieving a man that my uncle killed. She spent 3 days running from a lie he constructed specifically to break her. She did all of this while carrying my child. Silence on the line. I am absolutely certain, he said. The arrest of Kwon Dae-sung happened on a Thursday morning at a charity board meeting. Not in secret. Not quietly. In front of every member of Seoul's elite society. At a table where Dae-sung had sat for 40 years passing himself off as a patriot and a philanthropist and a man of principle. 3 national investigation officers, 2 prosecutors, 1 judge's warrant. And somewhere in a Lagos compound, a Nigerian woman in her late 50s, sitting in the garden with her feet in the grass and her hand on her stomach and the sun on her face, received a text message from her husband that said simply, "It's done." She sat with those 2 words for a long time. Then she tilted her face up to the sky. She thought of Emeka Okafor, young and brave and righteous, who had died trying to protect 3,000 families he had never met. He knows, she thought. Wherever he is, he knows. And the waiting, the grieving, the long decades of carrying both losses, his and her own, finally, at last, began their release. Months later, the baby came. Not in Seoul, not in a sterile private hospital with a skyline view and marble floors. In Lagos, in the same private family hospital where Adi's had been born 56 years earlier, in a room where her grandmother's photograph had been on the wall for 2 generations. Chisholm was there. Their cousin Ngozi was there. Jaewon's mother had flown from Busan, her first time on African soil, 74 years old, crying before the plane landed, and was seated in the corridor outside with her rosary and her Korean prayers and her absolute refusal to be anywhere else on earth. Jaewon never left the room. Not once. Not for 9 hours. He held his wife's hand with the same firm, certain grip he'd used the first night he took it in the Seoul penthouse, like a man who has made a permanent decision and intends to honor it. When the baby arrived, loud, insistent, furiously alive, screaming her objections at the cold, bright world with the full force of someone who had decided very early to take up space. The room erupted. Chisholm wept immediately and loudly and completely without shame. Jaewon didn't weep. He went completely still. The nurse placed the baby in his arms and he looked down at her. This impossibly small, phenomenally furious person. And everything about him, every wall, every year, every controlled, careful layer of a man who had survived by never being too open in any direction, dissolved. Completely. Silently. Ades, exhausted and radiant and watching her husband hold their daughter for the first time, said, "What are you thinking?" He looked up. "I'm thinking," he said slowly, "that I have spent my entire life building things. Companies, strategy, structures, empire." He looked back down at the baby. "And I have never built anything this significant in my life." Ades laughed. Tired and beautiful and full, the laugh that had first undone him in an airport arrivals hall a lifetime ago. "She is going to destroy you completely," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm already looking forward to it." They argued about the name for 3 weeks before the baby was born. Jaewon had suggested Korean names. Adaeze had suggested Igbo names. They had each lobbied firmly and listened politely and secretly not budged an inch. The compromise arrived, as the best compromises do, from an unexpected direction. On the 6th day after the birth, Jaewon's mother, who had not left Lagos, who had taken up quiet residence in the compound guest room and had begun teaching Chisholm how to make japchae in exchange for Chisholm teaching her egusi soup, came into the room where Adaise was nursing the baby. She sat down in the chair beside the bed. She looked at the baby for a long time. Then she said in careful English, "In Korean, there is a name. Sora. It means sky, the big one, the one that has no end." Adaise looked at her, and in Igbo, she said softly, "We have a name. Amara. It means grace, the kind that arrives when you least expect it and changes everything." Jaewon's mother nodded slowly. "Sora Amara," she said. The baby, as if she had been waiting for this moment specifically, opened her eyes, dark brown and enormous, looking at the room with the frank, ancient curiosity of someone who has arrived somewhere important and intends to stay. "Sora Amara Kwon," Adaeze said. Outside the room, Jaewon, who had been leaning against the corridor wall pretending he wasn't listening, straightened up, pressed his fingers briefly against his eyes, composed himself, walked in. 6 weeks after Sora Amara Kwon arrived in the world, her father carried her to the rooftop of the Seoul penthouse at sunset, the same rooftop where the Ixora flowers grew. where a table for two had held, once, the most important conversation of his adult life. He stood at the railing and held his daughter against his chest, her small face turned outward toward the city, and he said nothing for a long time. He thought about his father, his brother, the 20 years he had spent building an empire out of grief and calling it purpose. He thought about a dinner table with 12 dangerous men and a Nigerian woman who had set down a crystal glass like she was setting down a flag. He thought about a rooftop garden and Darjeeling tea and Ixora flowers, and I didn't fall. I arrived. He thought about a Lagos factory at dawn and his hand on his wife's stomach and the word 7 weeks feeling like the most staggering sentence in any language he had ever learned. He looked out at Seoul, his city, his empire, the kingdom he had built from grief and fury and pure relentless will. And he understood something he had never understood before. Not a revelation, not a dramatic realization, just a quiet, settled, unshakable truth. The empire had never been the thing. The empire had been the waiting room. This was the thing. This small, warm weight in his arms. The woman downstairs in the kitchen making tea and humming something he had heard her humming since the first night in the penthouse. A song he had once asked her about and she had said was an old Igbo lullaby her mother used to sing, the gold bracelet on her right wrist, the factory key in her bag, the way she said his name, Jay, when it was just the two of them, shortened, familiar, a private language of two people who had chosen each other deliberately and would keep choosing each other every day of whatever was left. Sora Amara made a sound against his chest, a small, decisive, profoundly self-assured sound, the sound of someone who had already decided she was going to be exactly as much as she intended. He looked down at her. "Your mother," he said quietly, "is the most extraordinary person either of us will ever meet. You should know that early." The baby looked at the city. The city blazed back. Inside the penthouse, Adazi looked up toward the ceiling with a small smile, because the baby monitor on the counter carried every word, and pressed her grandmother's bracelet to her lips. Then she finished making the tea. She waited 30 years for someone worth waiting for. He spent 40 years building walls she walked through without trying, and the child between them, impossible, miraculous, decided, arrived to remind them both. Everything that was taken from you was only ever making room. Part 3. Coming soon. What are you waiting for? Subscribe, like, and share this video. I promise you will be the first to get notified when it's out. Don't settle for half story, bestie. See you in the next. Thank you for staying with us thus far.